Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, or whenever you're watching this. This is George Armbuster, and this is my final project for Principles of Curriculum, the Color of Law and Education. The book I use, The Color of Law, was written by author Richard Rothstein, and in it he, quote, pens a historical and disheartening book that details residential segregation, racial zoning, racial profiling, subsidies for contractors to build white-only suburbs, and, quote, support for violent resistance to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Some front-loading necessary for this presentation. The following terms will be used quite a bit. First off, de facto segregation. The racial segregation, excuse me, that is not supported by law but by circumstance, such as socioeconomic status or political disparities. This contrasts with de jure segregation, which is racial segregation in accordance with government law or policy. There are then racial covenants, or agreements entered into by property owners and real estate agents, binding them not to sell, lease, or rent to specific groups, in this case, African Americans. Racial zoning or exclusionary zoning, which is where we're going to be getting our terms of redlining. This was a legal way for banks and real estate agents to keep white neighborhoods white and black neighborhoods black. And then this leads to redlining, which will be associated with the color-coded system that will be introduced later. This is the refusal of a loan or insurance to someone because they live in an area deemed to be a poor financial risk. And this, of course, leads to residential segregation, which is a practice in the United States that physically separated two or more groups into different neighborhoods. A brief history. To discuss the topic, we need to talk about when residential segregation began, which was with public housing in 1933 with the PWA, which was part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. The PWA, or Public Works Administration, from 1933 to 1939, its purpose was decreasing unemployment and increasing purchasing goods and services for the construction of highways and public buildings like schools. In regards to housing, the PWA built houses specifically for whites and then for blacks. The public work admin would intentionally demolish integrated neighborhoods in order to make segregated neighborhoods. Let me just underline that again. The PWA, if they encountered an integrated neighborhood, they would demolish that integrated neighborhood in order to create segregated neighborhoods. This was a pattern of behavior that spanned from Massachusetts to San Francisco to Atlanta. In 1939, residential segregation was ramped up due to World War II, and the federal government had to create housing for war workers employed for war construction. Some housing developments in the southern states, who still had Jim Crow laws, engaged in de facto segregation during this time. And when the housing was being built during World War II, this was state-sponsored segregation, or de jure segregation, as the federal government would develop temporary and shoddy housing along railroad tracks for African Americans who came to work during this time. White development suburbs were more stable and permanent in Berkeley, California. FHA policies. The FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, had a historical policy for being unwilling to insure mortgages to black homebuyers. A 1935 underwriting FHA manual states, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. The Homeowners Loan Corporation from the New Deal developed maps and color-coded these maps for agencies, like the FHA. These maps indicated neighborhoods that were either too risky to make loans to, or neighborhoods where it was safe to make these loans. Poor African-American neighborhoods were colored red, hence the term redlining. An example being Levittown, east of New York City, which created 17,000 homes. William Levitt submitted plans to the FHA for work and supplies needed, and also entered into a racial covenant, an explicit commitment to never sell, lease, or rent a home to African Americans. And here we will be looking at the color coding system, residential security map legend here. And this original map showing the redlined areas of disadvantaged African American neighborhoods. And you can bet that this will be areas where access to resources is compromised, the construction quality of the buildings is much less compared to, say, the more affluent areas. And here we have a quick breakdown, segregated residential graded areas. Now, these would be available to both policymakers and those who would be entering into contracts, selling homes, making sure that they kept in line with these racial covenants. Going into A, or first grade, these are newly built neighborhoods. These are full blessings given to underwrite mortgages and homes free of blacks. Make that clear, free of blacks. Second grade, or good neighborhoods, but beginning to fray. C are third grade, older neighborhoods. These are houses that are out of fashion. And then D, we go into the red or the fourth grade. These are neighborhoods that are struggling to survive. Mortgage lenders would refuse to make loans on these properties. In residential segregation and education, we get to the meat and potatoes of why this was chosen. In this, residential segregation affected education as well. The tactic that not only happened in southern states, but northern as well, was to relocate the segregated African-American schools and other services to segregated African-American neighborhoods and then refuse to bus those students to that school. So if parents wanted their child to be educated, they would have no choice but to move to those segregated neighborhoods, thus creating the community segregation. And mind you, these are neighborhoods where homes were shabbily built, garbage was rarely picked up, and streets remain unpaved. Additionally, I would say that access to goods and services was much reduced because businesses are going to be less likely to be nearby to these neighborhoods. Neighborhoods becoming isolated, thus depressing them further into economic hardship. An example being Austin, Texas, the 1928 East Side. The following can happen when de jure segregation affects impoverished African-American schools. With less access to preventative health care, disadvantaged children have higher absenteeism. With less literate parents, children may not have access to more complex language. With less adequate housing, families move more frequently, thus changing schools. This leads to instability in home life and can have a very disrupting effect on a child's educational process and their personal development. And with less access to food, students come to school more focused on receiving a hot meal than education. This goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This goes back to meeting base needs before needs of education can be met in a classroom. And this comes down to a popular saying that my spouse loves to use, until you handle Maslow, you can't get to Bloom. These neighborhoods sadly thrive in producing generational poverty. And when we talk about systemic racism, when we talk about social stratification, these are the neighborhoods we're talking about. It goes back to New Deal housing regulations. And the effects today, many of these neighborhoods that were created due to the de jure segregation by the PWA in the 30s, the Homeowners Loan Association, and local real estate agencies and authorities, they are still inhabited to this day. And thus the schools are still in these neighborhoods as well. And these residents are primarily poor African-American families. These families cannot sadly rise from state-sponsored segregated generational cycles that are plaguing these cities and communities. And until this country recognizes its own racial history and its purposeful tactics to segregate communities, these neighborhoods are doomed to repeat this cycle. I thank you for listening to my short informational presentation today, and these are my references and the podcast and obviously author Richard Rothstein's work here, both his essay and his book itself, The Color of Law, are essential reading and were very eye-opening. And it's the kind of thing that gets you angry and makes you want to get involved and makes you want to go out there and see how these things can be corrected and see what you can become a part of. I know as I read this book, I had to continue to sit it down and walk away. It's powerful, it's cutting, and it creates more than its fair share of guilt to those white people that read this book. You're going to be confronted with some powerful emotions. And whatever emotions you feel in this they're legitimate, and something needs to be done. Something definitely needs to be done. I thank you all for your time, and to all of you, have a great rest of your day.